Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Boss Economics World, the show where we slice through the economic baloney, expose the chaos, and serve you the juiciest financial satire with a side of stone-cold facts. I'm your host, the one, the only, boss economist extraordinaire, here to break down the madness of money, markets, and mayhem. And oh boy, do we have a doozy of a topic today. Grab your wallets, hide your savings, and let's talk about the almighty dollar, or should I say, the not-so-almighty anymore dollar. That's right, folks, we're diving headfirst into the swirling vortex of Trumponomics and the potential downfall of the greenback as the world's reserve currency. Buckle up, because this ride is gonna get bumpier than a trade war tariff tantrum. Now, if you've been paying attention to the financial circus, and let's be honest, who hasn't, you've probably noticed the US dollar has been taking a beating lately. I mean, a 10% drop in value in the first 6 months of this year. Yikes. That's the worst first-half decline since 1973, back when bell-bottoms were cool and inflation was hotter than a disco inferno. But here's the kicker, folks, some people, like a certain former president with a fondness for gold ties and big beautiful bills, don't seem to mind one bit. Why? Because a weaker dollar supposedly makes US exports more competitive. Sounds great, right? Well, hold your horses, because as we're about to find out, this could be the economic equivalent of trying to fix a leaky dam with a paper towel. Let's break it down, boss economics style. First, let's set the stage. The US dollar isn't just any currency, it's the king of currencies, the global reserve champ, the financial equivalent of a Roman emperor lounging on a golden throne. Right now, about 90% of foreign exchange transactions are conducted in dollars, nearly half of all global merchandise trade is dollar-denominated, and a whopping 60% of the reserves held by governments around the world are in greenbacks. That's right, folks, the dollar is the financial glue holding the global economy together. It's like the Wi-Fi of money, everyone needs it, even if it drops the signal sometimes. But how did the dollar get this gig? Well, as our good friend Barry Eichengreen, professor of economics and political science at UC Berkeley, explains, it's all about the Roman gods Mars and Mercury, war and commerce, baby. After World War II, the US emerged as the biggest kid on the block, both militarily and economically. We had the biggest guns, the biggest factories, and the biggest wallets. Our allies, from West Germany to Japan, were like, hey, Uncle Sam, protect us, fund us, and oh, by the way, we'll use your dollar because it's the only game in town. And thus, the dollar ascended to its throne, backed by America's unrivaled power and economic might. But here's the thing, folks, empires fall. And right now, the US dollar's throne is looking shakier than a Jenga tower in an earthquake. Why? Because the US isn't the biggest economy anymore. China's GDP, when measured by purchasing power parity, surpassed the US back in 2014, according to the World Bank. We don't manufacture as much as we used to. US manufacturing as a share of GDP has dropped from 28% in the 1950s to just 11% today, per the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And militarily? Well, let's just say we're not the only big dog in the yard anymore, with China and Russia flexing their muscles. Add to that a national debt that's ballooned to a jaw-dropping $37 trillion, yep, you heard that right, trillion with a T, and you've got a recipe for a financial horror show. And who's the ringmaster of this circus? None other than Donald Trump, whose Trumponomics policies have thrown gasoline on the fire. Remember his big beautiful bill? That's the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which slashed corporate taxes and added an estimated $1.9 trillion to the national debt over a decade, according to the Congressional Budget Office. Then there's his global trade war, slapping tariffs left and right, and his not-so-subtle attempts to politicize the Federal Reserve and government economic data. I mean, come on, folks, when you're trying to strong-arm the Fed into cutting interest rates by tweeting, "Fire Powell," in all caps, you're not exactly screaming, stable economic leadership. So, what happens if the world decides, you know what? We're done with this dollar drama. Well, buckle up, because it's not gonna be pretty. Now, let's talk about what happens if the dollar loses its crown as the world's reserve currency. Spoiler alert, it's not just a US problem, it's a global problem. When you're the reserve currency, you get some pretty sweet perks. For one, you can borrow money at super low interest rates because everyone wants to hold your debt. That's why US Treasury bonds are considered the safest asset in the world, even with a national debt that's bigger than the GDP of the entire European Union. Second, you get to run massive trade deficits without breaking a sweat. The US has been importing more than it exports for decades, racking up a trade deficit of $679 billion in 2023 alone, according to the US Census Bureau. And guess what? The rest of the world is happy to finance that deficit because they need dollars to buy oil, pay debts, and trade with each other. But here's the catch, if the dollar loses its reserve status, those perks vanish faster than a politician's promises after Election Day. Borrowing costs would skyrocket, making it harder to finance that $37 trillion debt. The trade deficit would become unsustainable, forcing Americans to either export more or import less. Translation: say goodbye to cheap iPhones and hello to pricier everything. And let's not forget inflation. A weaker dollar means imported goods cost more, and with the US importing $3.8 trillion worth of goods in 2023, per the US Trade Representative, that's a lot of price hikes. But wait, there's more. If the dollar falls, it's not just Americans who'll feel the pain. Emerging markets that have borrowed heavily in dollars, like Turkey, Argentina, and South Africa, would be in deep trouble. As of 2024, emerging market dollar-denominated debt stands at a staggering $13 trillion, according to the Institute of International Finance. If the dollar weakens, their debts become more expensive in local currency terms, potentially triggering defaults and financial crises. It's like a global game of dominoes, and the US is the first tile to fall. So, why is the world losing faith in the dollar? Well, as Ike and Green puts it, it's all about the noise and chaos in US economic policy. And let's be real, folks, the US hasn't exactly been a beacon of stability lately. Between trade wars, debt ceiling dramas, and political gridlock, the rest of the world is starting to wonder if America can get its house in order. And with China pushing its digital yuan, the European Union strengthening the euro, and even Saudi Arabia considering selling oil in currencies other than dollars, the greenback's dominance is looking more fragile than ever. Now, you might be thinking, okay, boss economist, if the dollar's on the ropes, who's going to take its place? Great question. Let's look at the contenders. First up, we've got the euro, which accounts for about 20% of global reserves, according to the International Monetary Fund. The euro's got a big market, a stable central bank, and a lot of trade clout, but let's be honest, Europe's got its own problems, from Brexit fallout to political fragmentation. Next, there's the Chinese yuan, which is making waves with China's Belt and Road Initiative and the rollout of its digital currency, the ECNY. But here's the catch, the yuan only makes up 2.5% of global reserves, and China's capital controls and lack of transparency make it a tough sell as a global reserve currency. Then there's the wild card, cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin, Ethereum, and stablecoins like Tether are all vying for a piece of the action, with the global crypto market cap hitting $2.5 trillion in 2024, per CoinMarketCap. But let's not kid ourselves, crypto's volatility makes it more of a speculative casino than a stable reserve currency. And finally, there's the possibility of a multi-currency world, where no single currency dominates, and countries use a basket of currencies for trade and reserves, like the IMF's special drawing rights. But here's the kicker, folks, replacing a reserve currency isn't like swapping out your old iPhone for a new one. It's a slow, messy process that takes decades, and it usually happens after a major crisis or war. Just look at the British pound, which lost its reserve status to the dollar after World War II, when the UK was broke and the US was booming. So, while the dollar's not going down without a fight, the cracks in its foundation are getting harder to ignore. So, what's the takeaway, folks? The US dollar's days as the world's reserve currency might be numbered, thanks to a toxic cocktail of Trumponomics, skyrocketing debt, and global competition. And if the greenback falls, it's not just Americans who'll feel the pain, it's the entire global economy. But hey, maybe this is the wake-up call we need to get our act together, cut the debt, and rebuild our economic leadership. Or maybe we'll just keep tweeting about big beautiful bills and hope for the best. Either way, one thing's for sure, the economic chaos is just getting started, and Boss Economics World will be here to break it all down, with a healthy dose of satire and a sprinkle of truth. Until next time, keep your wallets tight and your skepticism high. This is your boss economist extraordinaire, signing off.